Throughout my years keeping reptiles in wooden vivaria, I've come up with quite a number of different tips and tricks for improving your experiences with them, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing 10 of them with you. So let's get straight into it. A big drawback of having sliding glass doors is that when any loose substrate gets caught in the runners, it can actually scratch the runners and the glass as you open the doors, and it sounds absolutely dreadful. Now what I've invented to combat this is just a simple substrate barrier. To make one of these, all you need is a thin bit of wood or perhaps two battens stacked on top of each other, and then you drape some pond liner over them to prevent them rotting if the substrate behind them is moist. You place this barrier slightly receded back from the front of the enclosure, and what it'll allow you to do is have a deeper substrate layer without having any of it going to the runners. If you don't think that this looks very nice or won't suit your enclosure, then you could also screw some cork bark onto it just so that it blends in a bit better. If you cut your battens or piece of wood to just the right length, then you can wedge the substrate barrier in and it'll hold itself up, but if you want some extra support then you could use some corner brackets with screws going through, or you could just do what I've done, which is to silicone it in place. Another drawback of wooden enclosures is that they really do not like humidity very much, and even in dry enclosures you are likely to have a somewhat moist substrate, so that the bottom of the enclosure will end up rotting and warping over time. My preferred solution to this is simply to drop some pond liner into the bottom of the enclosure and then silicone up the side so that it forms an almost little box. To hold this fully in place, also put some silicone around the top of the pond liner, but do beware that in the heat of a vivarium, the pond liner will tend to peel from this over time, so I also like to add some screws around the top edge, preferably stainless ones that aren't going to rust, just so that it is held up over the years. Even if you have protected the bottom of your enclosure from water damage using the pond liner method, it still remains a good idea to put silicone up the joints of the enclosure to prevent any water getting in there if you ever spray the enclosure down. Now a particular trick I've come up with for this is actually not putting the silicone right up to the top of the enclosure. The reason for this being is that if you ever want to remove the lid of the enclosure, having silicone going right to the top is going to make this quite difficult. So if you just stop about 2/3 of the way up, then you do have free rein to remove the roof of the enclosure at a later date. Now the main reason I've ever had for wanting to remove a lid off a vivarium is actually for changing electrical items, so for example if you want to put a new light in or take an old light out. Now if, like me, you're going to put your wooden vivaria into a nice stack, then taking the lid off the enclosure suddenly becomes impossible and changing electrical items suddenly much more difficult. The branded Viv Exotic Vivaria actually have a solution for this built into the vents, but if you are going to be buying an unbranded vivarium, then what I would recommend doing is taking the back portion of the enclosure and cutting a hole into the top that is just large enough to admit a plug head. In future, this is going to make electrical changes much more simple, and on the inside, just to prevent any insects or perhaps even slim reptiles escaping, just get a little piece of plywood and paint it the appropriate colour, and then sort of screw it over the hole, and of course leave a little notch in the top for the cables. You can trust me when I say that if you're going to be putting your wooden vivs in a stack, that last tip is an absolute lifesaver. Another issue brought by stacking wooden vivaria is that the weight of the enclosures on top can actually make it impossible to remove the glass from the enclosure below. Now in a worst case scenario, the weight of the enclosures above actually begins to press down on the glass of the enclosures below, and this makes it more difficult to slide the doors open. What people will usually tell you to do to combat this is to put like a batten up in the middle, or perhaps have two different sections of doors with a plinth in the front to act as a support. But in my opinion, this doesn't look nice at all, and what I do instead is cut some branches and place them vertically throughout the enclosure. These do exactly the same job but actually look nice while they do it. If you are looking at doing this, it's worthwhile keeping in mind that wood will tend to shrink as it loses water, so if you put a branch that isn't fully desiccated into a vivarium like this and then it dries out whilst it's in there, the problem with the doors can resume. So the best thing to do is just to let your branches dry out completely before you turn them into pillars. Aquarium safe silicone is usually the go-to adhesive for putting branches and other decorations onto the side of an enclosure, but even in a glass vivarium I really would not trust it with extensive loads of cork or branches. Instead, it's better to cut out little boards of MDF and paint them to an appropriate colour so that you can use these as adapters for screwing things into the vivarium walls. For me, this has worked absolutely brilliantly for adding very large branches to my corn snake's enclosure, and also retrofitting the cork background in my leopard gecko's enclosure. And of course, unlike silicone, screws are completely removable, and if you just paint over the screw holes, if you remove the branch, then it really isn't noticeable at all. Most of the probes that come with thermostats and thermometers have little weird sucker thingies that you're supposed to use for attaching them to the side of the enclosure. Now, I don't know about you, but these absolutely never work on glass enclosures, never mind wooden ones. However, you can still use these suckers for attaching the probe to the wall of a wooden vivarium if you simply pop a few nails through them. Now, if you don't want to go with this setup, then what you can do instead is just cut a little piece of wood and tie the probe to it. The little piece of wood, of course, is just going to stop your reptile from shoving the probe around. Even with the best of intentions, wooden vivaria often aren't perfectly square, and therefore you end up with little gaps between the glass doors and the walls of the enclosure. Obviously this isn't the best, because the little gaps are a source of a draft and can also allow feeder insects to escape, but luckily the fix is really quite simple. All you've got to do is get some extra length of runner and put them up the sides of the enclosure so that the glass can slide into them and therefore remove any little traces of holes. A similar issue with wooden vivaria is that where the two panes of glass slide over each other, you can often find little insects crawling out from between the middle, and obviously escaping crickets and beetles ain't that fun. To solve this, you can actually get a little product that lots of people aren't aware of, and it's just this sticky tape stuff. I mean, I don't really know what you call it, but all you've got to do is put it in that middle section where the two panes of glass meet, and it provides an impassable barrier to feeder insects. It should be fairly obvious why you would want to lock an enclosure, namely because it's going to stop little kids getting in and also prevent little reptiles from getting out. But there's possibly something about locks that you don't actually know. There are actually two lines of different locks that you can get. Locks that all have the same key and locks that have different keys. So if you have loads of reptiles and looking for different keys all the time is going to be difficult for you, then actually look out for those locks that do have the same keys as each other so that you can just have one set that is going to be able to unlock all of your enclosures. Alternatively, if you've just got a couple of enclosures like me, then you can opt to go for the different keys so that it's just a little bit more secure. And that is your 10 tips for wooden vivaria. Now, if you did enjoy the video, then it would help out a lot if you could leave a comment saying that, and also like this video, and then subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on future uploads. But for now, I've been JTB Reptiles teaching you how to follow nature's example, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys! How about a bonus tip while you've watched this long? These little finger tab thingies just make it a lot easier to open the doors of an enclosure without getting fingerprints all up the sides.